Ancient Olympia is located at the west end of the Peloponnese Peninsula, in the midst of a fertile plain between the rivers Alpheos and Kleidos. Olympia is one of the sites that should be included in any itinerary of Greek sightseeing. It's one of the easiest archaeological sites to visit, since it has fairly level wide paths to walk through, lavatories and plenty of shade under the many trees. The site of Olympia has been inhabited since prehistoric times. In the 10th century BC, Olympia became a center for the worship of Zeus. The gymnasium was erected in the 2nd century BC. A little later, in the 1st century BC, the monumental amphiphrastyle propylon of the Corinthian order was added at the southeast corner. The gymnasium comprised an enormous open-air court bordered by 4 Doric colonnades or stoas. The athletes trained in the open-air court for the running races, the discus throw and the javelin. The east stoa is the so-called xystos, the covered colonnade equal to the stadium in length, where the runners trained when the weather was unsuitable. To date, half of the gymnasium has been explored. In the western part of the sanctuary, north of the Theokoleion, are the athletic installations, the palaestra and the gymnasium. The palaestra, dated to the 3rd century BC, is a large square building with a central court with Doric peristyle, enclosed by stoas with many rooms around them, such as the room where the athletes oiled their bodies before exercising, the conisterion where they powdered themselves, and dressing rooms. The central court was where the athletes practiced wrestling, boxing, the pancration and jumping. 32 of the original 72 columns of the peristyle court have been restored. The Greek Doric column has no base. Its massive shaft, generally treated with 20 flutes, terminates in a simple capital, composed of a group of annulets, a projecting curved moulding called the echinus, and a square slab or abacus at the top. The substantial square building covered over 4,400 square metres and enclosed a large peristyle courtyard. Although nothing remains of the brick superstructure and tiled roof of the building, its general layout can be deduced from the surviving columns of the peristyle. The courtyard itself was large and mostly unpaved. In the gymnasium, there were cold water washing rooms, sweating rooms, and a room for oiling the body. The Philippeion was erected near the west wall of the Altis in 338 BC. The circular monument was commissioned by Philip II of Macedon in celebration of both athletic and military victories. It was made by the Athenian sculptor Leochares in celebration of Philip's victory at the Battle of Cheronea in 338 BC. The Philippeion stood on a marble base 15.3 meters in diameter and was comprised of 18 Ionic columns. At Olympia, the Prytaneon was where the priests and magistrates lived. The high priest lived in Theokoleion. East of the Philippeion is the Heraion, a temple dedicated to the goddess Hera by the inhabitants of Skylos, who were allies of the Pisans. Initially it was Zeus who was worshipped here. The temple is one of the earliest examples of monumental temple construction in Greece and can be dated to around 600 BC. It's of the Doric order, with 6 columns along the narrow ends and 16 along the sides, a peripteral hexastyle. The columns, 5.21 meters in height, were originally of wood, but these were gradually replaced by stone columns. When Pausanias visited Olympia in 170 BC, there was still one wooden column standing in the opisthodomos of the temple. The Nymphaeon is a semicircular marble tank that held Olympia's water supply. It's a public fountain built during Roman times by Herodotus Atticus. This is the monumental spring water system dedicated to the temple by the benefactor Herodotus Atticus and his wife Regilla. In Olympia, there are the remains of all the sports structures erected for the Olympic Games, which were held in Olympia every 4 years, beginning in 776 BC. The first major excavation of Olympia began in 1875, funded by the German government. Excavation was continued in a more limited way between 1908 and 1929. The echostoa separates the sacred precinct from the stadium. The enclosure wall was extended in Roman times, and 2 monumental entrances were created on its western side. The entrance to the stadium, where the Olympic Games took place, was, as it is today, through the crypt, the hidden entrance which was built in Hellenistic times in the 3rd century BC. This is a vaulted passageway with a Corinthian propylon at the western end that was added in Roman times. Olympia is the birthplace of the Olympic Games, which started on these very grounds. In the year 776 BC, the first Olympiad took place at the sanctuary of Zeus and was repeated every 4 years for centuries thereafter. The date of the first Olympic Games, 776 BC, is the first accurate chronology of historical Greece. There are a few stone stands for the Hellanodikes, literally, the judges of the Hellenes. Here we see the marble starting block, which breaks the flat monotony of the stadium. Preserved today are only the stone crepice and fragments of the Ionic columns. Bases found along the length of the facade show that other dedications too were placed in front of the stoa. Here are some building remains of the stoa and part of an Ionic column from the monument of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe. South of the Bouleuterion is the South Stoa. It was built around 350 BC and was the main entrance to the Altis. It has an outer colonnade of 34 Doric columns and an interior colonnade in the Corinthian order. This is the first monument at Olympia in which the Corinthian order was used. A monumental profilon on the south facade gives the building a T-shaped plan. The west part of the building has yet to be explored. The most ornate of the 3 main orders of classical Greek architecture, characterized by a slender fluted column having an ornate bell-shaped capital decorated with acanthus leaves. The Bouleuterion was the seat of the Boule of the Eleans and the Hellanodicae, whose task it was to oversee the running of the games. Here too were examined the objections and violations of the athletes, and here the penalties were decided. The enormous Temple of Zeus stood in a conspicuous place at the centre of the Altis. It was erected from the spoils of battles won by the Eleans during the Tryphylean Wars. Its construction began in 470 BC and was completed in 456 BC, with Libon the Elean as architect. The columns were of local shell limestone, covered with white stucco. In the centre of the sanctuary, the remains of the imposing Temple of Zeus anchor the surrounding landscape with the monumental building foundation and the scattered massive columns, which once protected the gold and ivory statue made by Phidias. The temple, a peripteral hexastyle with 13 columns at the sides, has an east-west orientation. The hexastyle temple was constructed of local limestone and coated with stucco. Its dimensions stretched more or less 60 by 27 meters, with 6 columns at each end and 13 columns along each side. Excavations at the temple were begun by the French in 1829 and were completed by the German school. Parts of the sculptural decoration have been restored and are now on display in the Olympia Archaeological Museum, while the metopes removed by the French expedition of 1829 are in the Louvre. The columns were 10 metres high and slightly tapered, measuring more or less 2 metres in diameter at the base and 1.6 metres in diameter at the top. The Leonidaion was a large hostel for distinguished visitors, built around 330 BC. It was named after the donor and architect, Leonidas of Naxos. It's a large, almost square building with an Ionic exterior colonnade of 138 columns. On all four sides, there are rooms between the two colonnades. In Roman times, a decorative pool occupied the centre of the inner court of the Leonidaion. Because of its location, this is known as the Leonidaion Baths. Over the ruins of the workshop, a three-aisled Christian basilica was built between AD 435 and AD 451. The apse of the church was at the east end, where the entrance to the workshop had once been. The marble screen is still preserved in situ. The entrance to the church is in the south side of the narthex, the floor of which was paved with marble slabs. The wooden-roofed Basilica of Olympia, the oldest known early Christian church of Elis, was destroyed in the earthquake of AD 551. Of the workshop, only the orthostats of the walls remain. Both the superstructure and interior of the building belong to the church. Olympia lies amongst low wooded hills and near two rivers, the Alpheus and Cladeus, which have changed their course. Ancient Olympia is situated in an area of great natural beauty. It's considered one of the most important sanctuaries in antiquity and is dedicated to the father of all gods, Zeus. In 1989, the archaeological site of Olympia was inscribed by the World Heritage Committee